tarde a todos. Sejam bem-vindos, então, a este webinário, esta palestra virtual, com o nosso convidado, professor Oliver Gaycken, na Universidade de Maryland, nos Estados Unidos. Eu agradeço muito aqui a presença do professor Oliver Gaycken, por ter aceitado o nosso convite para falar aqui de cinema científico. Este evento é uma iniciativa do grupo de pesquisa LIC, né, o Laboratório de Imagem Científica. É um grupo que congrega pesquisadores de variadas instituições, Unifesp, Unicamp, PUC São Paulo, Universidade Mackenzie, e este evento é particularmente organizado por mim, Alfredo Suppia, pelo professor Cícero Silva, da Universidade Federal de São Paulo, e pela professora Jane de Almeida, da PUC de São Paulo, e também da Universidade Mackenzie. Bom, eu vou introduzir, então, aqui nosso convidado, o professor Gaycken, que é professor associado do Departamento de Inglês, e também Vanbury Distinguished Professor de Estudos Comparados, e também membro, né, do núcleo do programa de estudos de cinema e audiovisual, e do programa de literatura comparada da Universidade de Maryland em College Park. Ele é autor de um livro fundamental para os estudos de cinema científico, chamado Device of Curiosity, Early Cinema and Popular Science, publicado pela Oxford University Press, de 2015, e é autor também de uma variedade de artigos publicados em periódicos como Historical Journal of Film, Radio and Television, Science in Context, Journal of Visual Culture, Early Popular Visual Culture, a revista Screen, e a coleção Learning with the Lights Off. Bom, então agora eu vou fazer uma pequena introdução também em inglês. O evento será em inglês. Infelizmente não temos como fazer a tradução nem simultânea nem consecutiva, mas como moderador eu estimulo que todos façam suas perguntas pelo chat, em qualquer língua, seja português, seja em inglês, que tentaremos traduzi-las, se for o caso, e depois passar na sessão de perguntas e respostas ao professor Gaycken, que, no final de sua fala, haverá uma sessão de perguntas e respostas. Então, por favor, sejam bem-vindos para colocarem suas perguntas, certo? Então, agora vou passar para o inglês, fazendo a breve introdução, e depois passaria a palavra para o professor Gaycken. So, welcome, everybody. Thank you very much, Professor Gaycken, for accepting our invitation here. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this afternoon talk on scientific cinema, right? Allow me to introduce Professor Gaycken. He is Associate Professor in the Department of English, but also Vanbury Distinguished Professor of Comparative Studies, and a core faculty member of the Film Studies Program and the Program in Comparative Literature at the University of Maryland, College Park. He is the author of Device of Curiosity, Early Cinema and Popular Science, published by Oxford University Press in 2015. His articles have appeared in the Historical Journal of Film, Radio and Television, Science in Context, Journal of Visual Culture, Early Popular Visual Culture, Screen, and the collection Learning with the Lights Off. So thank you very much once again, Professor Gaycken, and now it's our pleasure to listen to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alfredo, both for that introduction and for the invitation. I am very happy and excited to share this work with you today. And I think, as we discussed, we'll start with about 15 minutes of a screening. And this film is entitled Film Ist. It's by the Austrian experimental filmmaker Gustav Deutsch. It came out in the late 90s, although it's a film that was thought of as an ongoing project. And so what we'll see here is the beginning of the first part. The first part, Film Ist 1 through 6, ran about an hour. So we'll watch about, the first 15 minutes of it. And what is interesting about this film, why it's relevant and why I'm talking about it today, is that it is drawn almost exclusively from archives of scientific and industrial cinema. So I want to start by sharing this opening of the film, and I'll come back to one particular part of this opening section in more detail in my talk. So I'm going to go ahead now and share my screen, and as soon as that is, here we go. So here then is Film Ist.
Da in früheren Filmen nur 12 Aufnahmen pro Sekunde möglich waren, mussten diese damals durch Doppelkopieren auf 24 gestreckt werden. Heute können jedoch 24 Bilder in der Sekunde aufgenommen werden. Dadurch sind die wissenschaftlichen Auswertungsmöglichkeiten wesentlich verbessert.
Here we are in our lovely Florida cul-de-sac. We are scanning the geometry of our
Okay, so I will come back to Film Ist and to one section of it in particular a little later in this talk. Let me get my PowerPoint up now. Go back to the share screen. All right. So today I'll be talking about Film Ist and the notion of encyclopedic thinking as a bridge between scientific and artistic modes of image practice. So the locus classicus for thinking about recycling in cinema and media studies is the compilation film. In one of the earliest accounts of this mode, J. Leida focused on the newsreel and its repurposing of newsreel footage by such practitioners as Esfir Shub, Hans Richter, Frank Capra, Alberto Cavalcanti, Len Lai, and Alain René. Another prominent tendency is to consider how the avant-garde has made use of cinematic recycling. Indeed, experimental cinema can lay claim to being the predominant site for creative reuse. And here I'm quoting from William Weese's book on this mode, where he writes, "The privileged realm of filmmaking for this project is experimental or avant-garde film, where the most interesting, aesthetically satisfying, critically informed, and politically challenging uses of found footage are to be found, or so it seems to me." End of quote. Largely absent from the established critical landscape, however, are accounts of film recycling in the domain of science, although this area has established myriad methods for using pre-existing motion picture materials. Today's talk takes a step in the direction of accounting for this kind of reuse by discussing an avant-garde film that consists entirely of scientific footage, Gustav Deutsch's Film Ist 1-6 from 1998. A predominant tendency in writing about Film Ist emphasizes the disparity of the materials from which Deutsch assembled his film. Alexander Horvath, for example, contends images which seemingly have nothing or little to do with each other in terms of origin, or don't belong together, are compared, interlaced, and considered related. Tom Gunning similarly highlights the importance of decontextualization for Film Ist, noting that the scenes Deutsch selects, quote, twitch like amputated limbs, displaying their unique features divorced from contextual meaning. Both scholars assume a fundamental difference among the fragments that Deutsch's film assembles. I have followed this tendency as well, linking Deutsch's editing choices to the figure of the surrealist flaneur, who discovers beauty in unexpected places. And here I'm quoting an essay that I wrote about a decade ago. The unusual visual power of Deutsch's archival discoveries is due in no small part to his isolation of them from their original contexts. He thus performs a liberating violence, establishing or at least concentrating their unexpected lyricism. End quote. This approach certainly pertains to much of Film Ist. A particularly memorable moment of this sort occurs when Deutsch interweaves a film about how the puff adder, a venomous snake, acquires its prey with a psychology film and an ophthalmological film, transforming what was intended as a record of snake behavior and teaching films for the sciences and medicine into the centerpiece of an avant-garde nightmare. And I'll show you this clip now. This transformative use of previously existing footage accords this transformative use of previously existing footage accords with a general tendency regarding the compilation film. As William Wiese writes, the film's montage exploits discrepancies between the image's original and present functions. One sequence of film ist functions according to a different logic, however, consisting of footage drawn almost entirely from one of Deutsch's key sources, the archive of the Institut für den Wissenschaftlichen Film, or the Institute for Scientific Cinema. This sequence functions not to radically transform the meaning of the footage it excerpts, but rather in accord with the organizational logic behind the original project. The reason for this congruence is that almost all of the films excerpted in this sequence stem from a specific IWF project, the Encyclopaedia Cinematographica. So in order to understand the significance of Deutsch's use of this material, and in particular his use of a specific kind of associational editing that was foreseen by the Encyclopedia project, we will need to briefly sketch the history of this significant Cold War era film archival project. Encyclopaedia Cinematographica, a brief history. The Encyclopaedia Cinematographica was a signature achievement of the Institut für the Wissenschaftlichen Film. As Mario Schulze and Sarine Waltenspühl have shown, the project's recourse to a formal system that emphasized objectivity represented an implicit attempt to distance it from the problematic heritage of a more recognizable documentary and fascist history during its previous incarnation during the 30s and 40s. The EC's chief intellectual architect was Gotthard Wolff, who served as its general editor for over 2 decades and wrote extensively about the theory and practice of the EC. The project's recourse to the encyclopedia as an analog is complex. At times, Wolff went as far back as the medieval university to describe it, writing in 1972, quote, "From time to time, scientists have called the work of the encyclopedia a studium generale, in which the idea of the universitas literarum still lives." But the EC was more clearly modeled on the modern encyclopedia, so it is helpful to consider its continuities with the encyclopedia tradition, as exemplified by Diderot's Encyclopédie. The EC shares with the print encyclopedia a fundamentally open-ended form. Wolff noted that the EC is, quote, "in effect, never finished." And he characterized its first 2,000 films, the fruit of over 2 decades of work, as a, quote, "good start." Another formal similarity is the reliance in both media on compilation as a compositional strategy. Of course, both the EC and print encyclopedias relied on novel research to create entries, but the basic idea was to summarize and exemplify existing knowledge, as opposed to producing new knowledge, which belonged primarily in the domains of journals and monographs. A possibility for novelty does arise, however, in conjunction with the final major similarity between the EC and print encyclopedias, namely the importance of systematic order. The encyclopedia is fundamentally more than just a collection of facts. It is more than the sum of its parts because of how it allows its users to compare and synthesize information. Consider here Diderot's definition of the encyclopedia project, drawn from his entry on Encyclopédie. Indeed, the purpose of an encyclopedia is to collect knowledge disseminated around the globe, to set forth its general system to the men with whom we live, and transmit it to those who will come after us, so that the work of preceding centuries will not become useless to the centuries to come, and so that our offspring, becoming better instructed, will at the same time become more virtuous and happy, and that we should not die without having rendered a service to the human race. Collection, systematization, and transmission. These are the crucial features inherited by the EC from the encyclopedic tradition. Additionally, however, the EC must be thought of as a specialty encyclopedia, an encyclopedia of movement. Its aim was to document processes that can only be understood by It consisted of 3 general categories: biology, ethnology, and the technical sciences. And its orientation was toward 3 main representational possibilities that cinema brings to the scientific enterprise: its ability to preserve movement, what Wolf referred to as Fixierung, its ability to transform time, so slow motion and time lapse, what he referred to as Zeittransformation, and its ability to render movements comparable to one another. A key formal feature of the EC was the notion of the so-called smallest thematic unit, which was thought of in relation to a general organizational matrix. This conscious emphasis on short, discrete, and comparable units was one of the EC's fundamental features, and it is responsible for the distinctive qualities that differentiate EC films from other forms of documentary cinema. So here you see a textual representation of this smallest thematic unit. So if you see here, Beuteerwerb means the acquisition of prey, and then here you could then see that's the activity, or rivalry, fighting, locomotion, and then you would go across according to species. So then you could compare how does the rat and compare with other species in terms of how it performs various activities. And so here's a visual example of prey acquisition. This is what's known as suction feeding. On the left hand, the peixe, found primarily in the Amazonian floodplain, and on the right hand, the mata-mata, also an Amazonian creature, a turtle. They both use a similar, or in some ways identical form of feeding. So this was one way to sort of use this comparative quality. Here's another. This is the maternal care among mammals of their young. So here you have a hedgehog and a squirrel. In this emphasis on systematic form, where the smaller units were only truly meaningful as part of a larger whole, and the term that Wolf often used was to think of the project as a mosaic, the differences between the EC and more familiar forms of nonfiction film become evident. Indeed, Wolf took care to differentiate among forms of nonfiction cinema, specifying, quote, "The scientific documentation film in a particular form is now the main source for the systematically planned film documentation in the scientific film encyclopedia." And this word, documentation, as opposed to documentary, is not an accident of translation. According to Wolf, whereas according to Wolf, the documentary film, Dokumentarfilm, with its tradition of advocating for social justice, worked on a level calculated to convey human emotion. But the 3 distinct and overlapping kinds of scientific film that the IWF prioritized were the research film, Forschungsfilm, the documentation film, Dokumentationsfilm, and then the university teaching film, Hochschulunterrichtsfilm. And these films had a different goal, which Wolf phrased thusly, quote, "A documentation film is a film that fixes a movement process with a high measure of reality and is conceived so that it can be approached from a number of different research perspectives." The films that constituted the EC, in other words, were meant to be documents more in the sense of cinema's pre-Gersonian documentary tradition, what Paula Ahmad has characterized as, quote, "cinema's inventorial applications," which were more prominent in the period of early cinema, but have been eclipsed by, on the one hand, cinema's hegemonic formation as an entertainment medium, and on the other hand, the specific discursive parameters of what we call the documentary tradition. This atypical form allows the EC films to be incorporated in Filmist in a way that does not run counter to their original meaning, but rather exemplifies the project's aims of comparative analysis. So I want to turn now to the Deutsch film again. And as I mentioned, the film is built in this way that is, systematic in terms of its organization. So it's divided into named and numbered sections, and each contains within it numbered subsections. So the section that I'm interested in talking about now for the next part of my talk is section 1.3. And I want to, since it's been a few minutes and it's always good to see things more than once, I want to go back and just watch it one more time before I start to talk about it. It runs about 4 minutes. So the first step of analyzing this sequence is to create a filmography. And as we create this filmography, you see here a film from the early to mid 70s about the locomotion of the cat. And then all the films that are preceded with an asterisk are films that come directly from the Encyclopaedia Cinematographica project. So here the film about pigeons flying in slow motion. Film about locomotion in humans, in human children from the 50s. The peacock flying from the late 70s. The second film, this time a little girl, part of the human walking series. And here the moth, the first of two films of chimpanzee locomotion juxtaposed with a different film about pigeon flying, pigeons in flight, the second chimpanzee locomotion film, and then a film about perception, which on the one hand seems like a bit of a departure, but I think there's a way that it makes sense in terms of the logic of the editing progression. It returns to this film about flying, this time a bat. And then finally, the one film that's clearly sort of not part of this larger section in terms of, you know, the kind of work that it's doing. This is a DEFA film, an East German documentary film about the airport. But if you remember from the opening section that I screened, one thing that does connect this to the next section is this emphasis on circular movement. So the circulation, or the sort of radial movement here of the radar is a bridge to section 1.4. So establishing that most of these films, the overwhelming majority, come from the EC project. I want to talk a little bit about what I see as the editing pattern that Deutsch is establishing here. And it seems to me that the editing pattern is very much in line with the Encyclopedia project's emphasis on comparison. So for the first 2/3 of the section, Deutsch juxtaposes the smallest thematic unit of two different kinds of locomotion, walking and flying. So we have first the walk of the house cat compared to the flight of pigeons. Then we have the male child's walk compared to the flight of a peacock. Then the female child's walk compared to the flight of the hummingbird hawk moth. And then the walk of a chimpanzee compared to the flight of a single pigeon. The fifth pairing departs from the established pattern as the four-limbed walk of the chimpanzee is compared to several shots from this film about the perception of movement called Bewegungssehen. But I think here the point of comparison is less a departure than a shift, a pivot from a kind of foot wing dyad to animal hand, human hand. And then there's a further connection with the zigzag that's drawn by the hand to the sort of way that the bat's wings periodically form their own zigzag when it's in flight there, feeding from the tube. And then there's other connections too. Obviously, the bat returns to the motif of flying. So this change in the pattern near the end suggests that Deutsch's use of these encyclopedia films is not identical to their initial intended use, where comparison among different types of locomotion or limb functions would very likely be sufficient and the only thing that the viewers would be interested in. And of course, there are other ways that Deutsch's appropriation departs from the uses to which the EC films were typically put, beginning with the experimental soundtrack that clearly marks the footage as something other than a scientific record. and the vast majority of the EC films were silent. That was in fact the fundamental or the basic setting, and you would only add sound if sound were a critical component of the phenomenon that was under observation. Finally, Deutsch's associational editing that takes over in this last third of the sequence is also detectable earlier. So you could read the cat as startling the pigeons, for instance, and that's very much in line with the sort of games that Deutsch plays throughout the film, finding connections, this sort of Kuleshov effect between one shot and the next. And that's very much sort of in line with the more typical understanding of what compilation film does, is that it creates these unexpected connections among disparate materials. And I think in general, because it's an avant-garde film and because it's being put in that framework, we have a tendency to read filmist's images differently. So more with an eye towards graphic abstraction and metaphor. Nonetheless, in this instance, the coincidence of experiment is more than an epiphenomenon. Here, I think art and science are less in conflict and much more in alignment. In his use of the EC films, Deutsch has not simply created an aesthetic dimension where previously there was not one. These films' scientific qualities include an aesthetic dimension. The provision for unexpected use, while allowing for the transit of these images into the domain of the avant-garde, also is part of the scientific promise that was a condition of their institutionalization. As Wolf wrote, quote, "The standard issue research film usually serves a certain clearly circumscribed hypothesis, for instance, an investigation of the phases of movement in cell division, certain animal behaviors, or the movements of a quickly moving machine. When such a clearly circumscribed research film is used, it almost always turns out that the finished recording contains material for further insight, which one did not think of in the original definition of the problem." End of quote. The scientific film thus remains open to the future, containing a kind of surplus knowledge that the encyclopedia films were made with an eye towards maximizing. Individual films can have an unforeseen dimension to them, and the entire project aggregates and multiplies that potential. In this sense, the EC's vision of a cinematic database resonates with other, more familiar projects from the histories of art and cinema. Abby Warburg's Mnemosyne Atlas, what Lev Manovich calls Ziga Vertov's database aesthetic, and Charles and Ray Eames's found footage filmmaking, about which Orit Halpern recently has noted, quote, "The Eames office as a design practice largely worked through recombination." Since Deutsch's engagement with these films in the late 90s, the Encyclopedia Cinematographica has begun to be recirculated via the Technische Informationsbibliothek, the German National Library of Science and Technology in Hanover. And here is what that interface looks like. The TIB AV portal, largely under the open access license terms of Creative Commons, has made a really huge chunk of the encyclopedia and IWF films available. As the library explains, quote, "In many cases, TIB has to renegotiate rights with the holders and agree upon the discontinuation of existing license restrictions. Only then can films be made freely accessible online, enabling their future application for types of use that are, as yet, unknown to us today. After all, there is no telling which services will be commonplace in a few years' time. This way, the films can be used in a variety of manners, fostering scientific exchange in the digital environment." And Deutsch is not the only filmmaker to have turned to the EC films since the dissolution of the EC and its parent organization, the IWF. The German artist Christopher Keller. So here's another. So this is the search page on the TIB AV portal. I searched IWF, and you can see the hundreds of films that come up. And then this is what an individual film's page looks like. So you can play it. A lot of times you can download it for free in 2 different resolutions. So it's really a wonderful recirculation project. So here is Christopher Keller's 2001 installation in Berlin that was entitled Encyclopaedia Cinematographica, which consisted of 40 monitors displaying loops from the biology films. So this is what the monitors would look like. They would endlessly loop movement cycles, which is an interesting kind of connection to the history of animation and the history of animation's link to scientific imaging. So we can think here of, Muybridge flip books or other uses of kind of motion analysis within film history. Now, more recently, another Berlin-based filmmaker and artist, Andreas Bunte, has taken the EC as a point of departure for a series of what he calls filmic experiments, which he sees as particularly indebted to Gotthard Wolff's notion of the Bewegungsdauerpräparat, a term that analogizes film and biological specimens, taxidermied or wet or microscope preparations. And so I have a brief clip here from one of Bunte's films that documents, it's called Safe Disassembly. It documents an industrial operation in the former East Germany where cluster munitions are being taken apart. So I'm just going to show a brief clip of this to give you a sense of his work and its connection to this encyclopedia tradition. And here I think the emphasis is on on duration. So slow cinema as a form or scientific cinema as a form of slow cinema. So to move towards a conclusion, Gotthard Wolff used a quotation from Alfred North Whitehead as an epigraph to a book published in 1967 that commemorated the publication of the encyclopedia's 1000th film. A fresh instrument serves the same purpose as foreign travel. It shows things in unusual combinations. The gain is more than a mere addition. It is a transformation. And I'll just add that this is a part of a longer quotation, the first part of which is actually much more well-known of Whitehead's. The reason we are on a higher imaginative level is not because we have a finer imagination, but because we have better instruments. This technically aided transformation of perception is not only, or not even primarily, a matter of an external form of aesthetic appreciation. Rather, it stems from an immanent quality where beauty and use inform one another. As Film Ist demonstrates, avant-garde appropriation of motion pictures can function in tandem with, and not just in opposition to, the image's original meanings. In this sense, the knowledge that the EC films contain can be said to travel well. Motion pictures, in other words, constitute a particularly mobile form of knowledge, not only recording complex movement, but also allowing for that movement to circulate among various contexts, from the scientific congress to the popular lecture to the internet. This mobility is a function of both the moving image's medial nature, as well as its appeal to the senses, its spectacular qualities. The rhetoric of education often draws on precisely these qualities of the moving image, its vividness, its ability to produce a lasting, memorable experience. And these, what the historian of science Ludwig Fleck has termed exoteric qualities, link scientific and non-scientific audiences. Ultimately, the EC films draw on cinematic vision's vivifying, mobilizing qualities, utilizing the medium's power to put knowledge in transit. As a concluding thought, I'll cite Wolf one more time, who wrote, "The encyclopedia film can provide a certain research-like witnessing. We have often experienced that sober and rational scientists, at the projection of research films that made certain processes visible for the first time, broke out in elation or fell into amazement." So that is the conclusion of my talk, of the paper for today. And now I have a couple of other films that we can either watch right now, or we can go to some questions. Alfredo, how do you want to go on this?
Yeah, maybe. What about we can watch the film clips right now, and then after that we have like a Q&A.
Sure. Okay. So I brought two other things that are related to specifically the kind of international dimension of how scientific films circulate, and that have a particular link to Brazil. So the first is a tandem, is a pairing of two films. So there's this film from 1969 that was shot in Basel, Switzerland. And it's part of the Encyclopaedia Cinematographica's interest in sort of European self-ethnography. And so it's called Fadenspiele, or string games. And so it shows a couple of teenagers, Ruth and Gertrude Berger, who are 13 and 15 at the time of this filming, and they're demonstrating a variety of string games that they've taught themselves and that they and their friends were responsible for circulating among themselves. So you see there the Eiffel Tower. Here's the coffee cup. Here are the devil's horns. And here they are. Oh, I do have a video clip too then. Here they are working on a kind of a combination, so they can pass it to each other. And then, yeah, and one more, and this is the magic knot. So juxtaposing this with another film that actually was made quite a bit earlier, and it was not made in the context of the EC at all, but because of the sort of shared qualities of ethnographic film, still functions in a similar way of being something that can be compared and be made part of a kind of a large-scale comparative project. Film that was shot in South America by the German anthropologist Theodor Koch-Grünberg in 1911. And so this was among the Taulipang children, and I guess the tribe is sometimes called Pemon, and it was near Mount Roraima, so up in the north. And here is the connection. So that's the one. And then the other thing that I wanted to share is this film. This film was made quite a bit later. This was made in 1992. And it's about, there you see the IWF's last attempt at a logo update. So it was made in 92 by a German botanist, and it was about the symbiotic relationship between certain flowering plants and bees. But what's interesting here is the location of the filming. And I think you'll be, I mean, the voiceover narration is in German, but I think you'll be able to pick out the location name when she says it. And if not, I'll repeat it in a moment. So this is, just watch the first minute or two of this.
In weiten Gebieten Südamerikas, wie hier im Staate São Paulo, finden sich häufig nur noch Restbestände des ursprünglichen Primärwaldes. Diese sind jedoch auch heute noch sehr artenreich. In mehreren Stockwerken überragen hochwüchsige Bäume das Unterholz. In dieser reich strukturierten Vegetation nutzen holzige Lianen freistehende Bäume als Stützen, um an das lebenswichtige Sonnenlicht zu gelangen. So auch Vertreter der Malpighiaceen. Allein aus dieser Familie sind in den Neotropen rund 950 Arten bekannt. Im brasilianischen Naturreservat Mata de Santa Genebra bei Campinas beginnen die meisten Malpighiaceen-Arten im Februar zu blühen. Darunter auch Stigmaphyllum lalandianum, deren dicht beblätterte Girlanden nun gleichmäßig mit einem hellgelben Blütenflor überzogen sind.
So there you have it. This was actually, I had done a search for Brazil in the TIB AV portal, and this is one of the films that came up, but I didn't realize until Alfredo, said, hey, this is literally right next door. This is in Campinas, the nature preserve Mata de Santa Genebra. So a final kind of fascinating moment of unexpected connection that I see as a kind of basic premise of these of this kind of filmmaking. And I guess then that's that. And I'm looking forward to hearing what people have to say, questions, comments, and so on.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's nice. Makes it seem like less of a void that I'm talking into.
Thank you so much, Oliver. So yeah, we can open for questions, and we have a couple of questions here. Well, first of all, thank you very, very much for accepting our invitation, because I didn't mention that at the beginning, but actually you are recovering from a surgery. So
yeah, well, minor. It's very, very minor.
But still, it's thank you so much for being with us. And well, I have a couple of questions myself, but I'm going to start with Jorge Prudencio Lozano's question. He's a dear friend from Universidad del Quindío from Colombia. And let me just put my mic just a second. And
there you go. Okay, so I'll try to translate his question here. He asks you, what's needed or what's lacking right now in terms of social and cultural environment to have the audiovisual media accepted as or regarded with the same status as the written documents or scientific papers. I mean, yeah, probably. That's $1 million question.
No, it's a great question. It's a fundamental question, and it's a question that I think the answer to it is different now than it was even 10 or 15 years ago, because increasingly this is an area that is becoming very active in the world of academic research, both from the perspective of cinema and media historians, and from historians of science and technology and medicine, because I think there are kind of parallel and now convergent and sometimes overlapping research agendas that have brought this kind of filmmaking to the fore. So within my discipline of cinema and media studies, this is an outgrowth of, on the one hand, documentary scholarship, and I think it's part of this turn towards non-theatrical media that's happened in the last 10 years or so. So this, kind of recognition of the vast amount of material that was created to circulate outside of cinemas, in schools, in institutions, and so scientific filmmaking is a kind of a subset of that larger area. And then within the sciences, within the history of science and medicine and technology, the recognition that the moving image was something that was, kind of incredibly widely used. And it's something that those scholars have only slowly started to come to grips with. I think because for a long time they saw cinema as a kind of, extra unnecessary kind of a form of popularization. It was never thought of particularly centrally in the same way that textual documents were. But things have been leading towards this. So the interest within science studies since the 70s in images has helped train people to pay attention to the visual, and there has been an increasing interest, especially among younger scholars, towards finding new areas that haven't been investigated yet. And there's so much at this juncture, and that's also partly why I think it's taken a while, because it is these are kind of records. These are things that are difficult to understand without combining the insights of the history of science and cinema and media studies. Because if you just come at it from the questions that scientists and historians of science ask, you often miss the things that media scholars have been trained to pay attention to. I would say one other thing about that, which is that this is also an area that is often at the mercy of past archival decisions. And the been most kind of sensitized to recently is how often film gets separated from textual materials, even if they were created together and meant to be thought of together initially. So you think about how often within educational film, a film and a booklet and maybe a film strip and a poster, they were all created as part of the same campaign. And nowadays, in a lot of archives, they will be put in 4 different areas. And so to be able to sort of put the pieces together is often, sometimes it's impossible because things have disappeared or just those linkages aren't obvious anymore. But my sense is that non-theatrical media and science films in particular have to live and were made to be understood within this sort of contextual envelope in a way that entertainment films and documentary films weren't. Entertainment films and documentary films, their purpose was to go out and to be self-contained commodities, and often that's not the case with these other kinds of films. And so I think that's an important. And that's maybe also partly why it's taken longer and it's more difficult. because sometimes the films by themselves are very hard to understand. You know, just a film of an operation. You know, what do you do with that? It is a lot more interesting than when you can connect it to its context. And so I think that's, you know, those two things, that disciplinarily, there's been a movement that is now converging on this area and allowing people to start working on it. And then this archival dimension of starting to sort of pay attention and be able to reconnect to this, you know, kind of audiovisual heritage is, those are the two things that come to my mind about, you know, from that question.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Excellent. Thanks, Oliver. There is another question by Gianni. Could you talk a little bit about Bazin's quote, beauty do hasard, the kind of la beauté du hasard, no? About scientific films?
Sure. I guess it really wouldn't be a talk of mine if this didn't come up. I find myself coming back to this essay over and over and over again. So this is this beautiful essay that Bazin writes in 1947 when he's reviewing a festival that Jean Painlevé has put on in Paris of science films. And Bazin makes these, you know, extraordinary claims for the science film. You know, he calls it the most beautiful form of cinema, and he has this, you know, kind of fascinating kind of paradox at the heart of that, which is to say it's the most beautiful form of cinema because it never tries to be beautiful, and that's the beauty of chance that he's talking about, the accidental beauty. And so, you know, I see that as very much operative with these films, although part of what, or maybe the main thrust of what I was trying to get at today, is that it's not the only way to understand the aesthetic dimension of these films, because I think there is a kind of an aesthetic discourse within science that is part of science, not just, you know, from the outside, you know, the artist who comes and finds the sort of beautiful things that scientists are insensitive to, but there is a kind of a beauty in insight, in the kind of understanding that cinema can provide. And that was, I think, the main point of the last quote, where Wolf is describing, you know, astonishment and this, you know, kind of state of, you know, kind of almost ecstatic state that he's seen scientists fall into when they've seen something new, when they've seen something for the first time. And so, you know, I think those two things are sometimes coexisting, but sometimes it's a sort of toggling back and forth. You know, I think Deutsch's film does this. I think, you know, the film, sometimes there are moments of beauty that he finds and isolates or creates through his editing, and then sometimes he's building on things that are already there. And this section that I showed you today and that I kind of went into detail on, I think that's what's going on there. And that is new for me. That sort of surprised me when I went back to it. And this is this is a talk that is drawn from a piece that I'm writing for a special section that is focused on the notion of recycling within scientific cinema. And so when I went back, I thought I was just going to sort of do more of what I had said before about Deutsch, you know, kind of maybe go into more depth about some of the films that he uses. But then I was like struck by this strong counterexample of his editing following the contours of the Encyclopedia's sort of matrix comparative logic. So this is something that I still feel is kind of philosophically, aesthetically, I'm still working my way towards a proper account of this, you know, the kind of the beauty of utility and the function of aesthetics within scientific practice. Like, I have a notion that that's important, and I have a few of the arguments, but it's something that I still need to refine and elaborate.
Great. Yeah, by the way, I know that as far as I know, Bazin was very, very fond of the nature in general, I think. And there's a story, I don't know if it's a hoax but according to this legend, he once came to Brazil and he wanted to take some animals from Brazil, a little alligator, I think, or something. Of course, he didn't do that. And when people told him about it wasn't possible, etc. And he was a kind of he was really fond of nature in general, animals and everything. So there's it's much about these.
Didn't he take a bird though with him from?
I think maybe because I think he
took a parrot.
Yeah, but I think he wanted more animals, but it wasn't possible, of course. But yeah,
no, I've heard the same story or a similar story about him smuggling an exotic bird.
Maybe he did. At least I saw a picture of him with in France, and he had a bird, and that bird didn't look like an European bird or something. Maybe, I don't know.
I think that's true. And you're right. The kind of his fascination with nature in general and with animal life in particular is another strong link. But between the kind of material that Deutsch is working with, and I agree with what Jana says in the comments that Film ist is a Bazanian film. I think that's another connection that maybe I could make more explicit.
But Oliver, because I've seen that link between Bazin and Deutsch's films, but what about Krakauer? Because Krakauer had also kind of a realist theory, and I don't know, but as far as I remember, it might be even closer. I mean, in terms of this revelation of nature, film as an epistemological tool for understanding reality. What do you think about that?
I think that's productive. And in fact, someone I know and who you might know, James Cahill, who teaches at the University of Toronto, had just written a fantastic book about Painlevé. He is working on this connection between Bazin and Krakauer, which is partly biographical. I think that they are connected, but more on the level of their writings. And this is something that I noticed a while ago, and I've never really gone too much farther with it, but both Krakauer and Bazin have a real emphasis in their film theory on this notion of revelation, that film can reveal the world, and that's much more important than kind of being able to reproduce it. And I think in that sense, a lot of the things that scientific cinema does, its ability to transform time, to show us things that are too slow or too fast for our normal perception, all of the sort of the registers of light that it's able to interface with that we wouldn't normally be able to see, that kind of revelatory quality is a core function of scientific cinema. And I think it's one of the things that attracted both Bazin and Krakauer, although Krakauer is less explicit about his interest in science as a form of filmmaking. And so for him, it does come from a kind of a different vantage point, a different angle.
And watching these Gustav Deutsch films, something that came to my mind is just that because actually the Encyclopaedia Cinematographica was founded. It's a project that was founded in the 50s, right? 1950s or
yeah.
It makes me think about Vannevar Bush's article, As We May Think, one of the kind of some people consider him one of the the foreseers, the scholars that foresaw the internet and this idea of a repository of containing all human knowledge. How do you see that, like the Encyclopaedia Cinematographica in this context, perhaps as a pre-internet tool or initiative, or whatever?
Yeah, this is a really interesting connection, and it's something that so there are a number of other scholars in Germany and Austria who are starting to work on the IWF and the Encyclopedia, and through them I've sort of learned that cybernetics was in fact one of the contexts that the organizers were working. So they I think explicitly saw connections to this, and that's something that that's about all I know about it for now. Although I think you can see a little bit already in this notion of, kind of a mosaic. You're not far from a database, and this idea of recombination, that is a kind of a proto-digital conception of how things work. Of course, the digital going all the way back to the Middle Ages in that way of, kind of a citational form or a cross-referenced form of reading. So absolutely, the Bush and the Memex, I think, they're whether they're explicitly linked or not, you can totally see like the Encyclopaedia Cinematographica as a module that you could plug into a machine. And this is one of the things too that I want to do with this project. This project of the encyclopedia film, or the sort of the interface between the notion of the encyclopedia as a mode and film history, is on the one hand a kind of a history of failure. There's lots of people who talk about it, starting with Murray. Murray, talks about, Muybridge's chronophotographs are going to give us an animated zoology. And then other people, Charles Urban, all are fascinated by the notion of creating a kind of a large scale and moving picture encyclopedia. And yet it never really works out unless you want to think of the internet as kind of a modern day realization of this. And so I have, and this is something that I think that I will work on together with some of these scholars in Europe who are interested in the encyclopedia, to see if there are ways to revivify the encyclopedia films by connecting them to contemporary projects that are very similar. So there's this one project in the US called the Encyclopedia of Life, and it was founded by E.O. Wilson when he won a big prize and got a lot of money for that. And it's a website that has one page for every species on Earth. And so each page, mostly it's a textual description, but they can host images and moving image files too. So I want to talk to them and see, is it possible to link, some of these encyclopedia films to the Encyclopedia of Life? Because a lot of these films are, very, this is one of the kind of fascinating premises of this kind of filmmaking, is that it doesn't age. It doesn't age in the same way that like entertainment films do, like a bat feeding, whether it's shot in the 50s or the teens or in 2030, is the same. It's the same animal or the same basic kind of thing. Although I guess in some ways that's maybe that's not entirely true. Maybe nature isn't quite as timeless as that, but
chances are some animals they are only on the screen, right? Maybe some of the species are some species, they are gone, and we have only on the screen.
No, this is another really kind of very interesting offshoot of this, and again something that James Cahill is also working on, and others too, Jennifer Peterson, thinking about nature films, natural history films as archives of sort of the relationship between humans and climate and nature, so that older ones you see have species that no longer exist or ecosystems that have been radically altered. I mean, I was curious to know. I mean, this is a nature preserve, but it's 30 years ago. So 92, you know, it's almost 30 years between then and now. Like, are things the same, or have certain things already changed in those last 30 years?
And have you ever heard of, because, you know, this Encyclopaedia Cinematographica, it's not only about, you know, animals and movement, because you showed us some footage about the girls, and so it's all about culture too, right?
Yeah.
And in Brazil, we had in the 30s, starting in 1936, we had this National Institute for Film and Education, something like that, Instituto Nacional de Cinema Educativo. And there's a series of films registering not only kind of some scientific experiments and procedures and so on, but also landscapes, species and animals and etc. But also culture, like popular songs, some lifestyle of people in the countryside, things like that. And many of them, like hundreds of these films, they were directed by Humberto Mauro, a Brazilian filmmaker. So I think there maybe you can find in a number of different countries initiatives like that, like in terms of creating an archive of landscapes, living beings, and culture as well.
Yeah, it's so you know, one of the three major fields, or you know, sections of the encyclopedia was ethnography.
Yeah,
and those films are actually the hardest to get a hold of now. I'll show you. I'm going to share my screen again quickly. What happens? So you know, there are a number of films from Brazilian expeditions, and those are the ones that tend to be restricted. So here's a film about the Vaura making manioc, and this was shot in it was released in 66. It was shot in 64, but it's embargoed. And I think there are a variety of reasons. I think part of it is the ethnographic methods used at various times by the encyclopedia filmmakers are no longer considered ethical. So there were things that were being photographed, or you know, kind of, there were things being photographed that maybe shouldn't have been, or they didn't ask. So there are a number of films about the Vaura, the Yawalapiti. This one I would love to see, fishing by poisoning the water. I found that kind of fascinating. But so the ethnographic section is in some ways the most difficult section to research. You have to go, I think, there, because most of the films are only available to be watched on site, whereas these other ones are more freely circulating. So it's an interesting it's an interesting kind of qualification of this attempt to create a timeless universal record of things.
Yeah, great. We have another question here, Oliver, please, from Alexandre Sonego. He asks if it was art, specifically film art, the path that would lead metaphysics to the perception of science. That's his question.
Yeah.
Considering the film and the perceptive field of science. What do you think about that? Could you comment on?
I could try. So, I mean, I guess. So if the question is can art lead to a kind of a change in perspective, kind of a philosophical change in perspective of what science does? And I think absolutely. I think that, you know, kind of art and science, as much as they're often posited as polar opposites, are in fact in constant contact, and that, you know, scientists have kind of a philosophically inflected worldview, and also an aesthetic sense, both explicit and implicit. And this is, I think, partly what I was trying to point to today with this connection between Deutsch and the encyclopedia. So it's not just that Deutsch is mining the encyclopedia and finding in it things that were unappreciated and transforming them, but that, you know, at least to a degree, the things that he's doing there overlap with the kind of procedures and visual experiences that scientists were interested in. I mean, I guess I'm a little bit thrown by the issue of metaphysics, but if the second question then is a clarification, cinema and the perceptive field of science, then I think maybe I've answered that.
Yeah, and also in your book, The Device of Curiosity, actually you talk about these blurred lines between fiction films and scientific cinema, right? I remember that some of the chapters talking about Charles Urban and also Fayad, Louis Fayad, and that's interesting.
I definitely see connections, and the other question from Jorge about the relations between cinema and education is a great instance of this overlap. That you know, sort of educational cinema on the one hand, but then also as he brings up Jurassic Park, you know, Jurassic Park has a kind of you know, paleontological scientific discourse embedded in it, and it was, you know, kind of part of Spielberg's commitment to make the animals, to make the dinosaurs animals, not monsters, and so he worked with paleontological advisors, and then there was a sort of another turn of the screw, because the way that he portrayed dinosaur movement made paleontologists question. It made them, you know, kind of try to prove the film wrong. They were like, no, you know, the sort of the famous thing that got a lot of attention was the question of whether T-Rex can actually run. You know, can't it? Like the film shows us, but you know, so there was a whole kind of research area that developed around, or kind of spurred on by the film. And so I think this is something that happens a lot, that there's a lot of back and forth between the cultures of science and entertainment. And it's not only, you know, the sort of the way that this is often framed is, and it's usually framed this way by scientists, you know, like, did the movie get something right? Or you know, is there a sort of a scientific kind of reality that the scientists then have to reassert? And I find that kind of discourse often really limited and not as interesting as the sort of the question of how things go back and forth. So it's not just sort of science coming in and correcting movies, but it's thinking about how science and movies, you know, kind of mutually inform each other.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a couple of days ago, I read something about scientists finding evidence on DNA preserved in amber or something like that. That was a premise was a kind of fictional premise for the Jurassic Park movie. They found an insect preserved in amber. So maybe,
well, I mean, not entirely fictional, and then that goes back to the source, the Michael Crichton book. And you know, Crichton is himself a kind of a scientific popularizer whose books have bibliographies, and he was in touch with lots of people at the time. So I think, you know, he was going beyond what had been discovered, but it's not all that surprising that, you know, he doesn't usually go too far into the future. And so I think that as a premise, the fact that it's been demonstrated doesn't surprise me. It was similar to in the course of the film, they discovered a raptor species that they thought that they were making up for the film, and then it turned out that somebody else found it. You know, so that there are these kind of overlaps and instances of you know, reality following fiction that I think are are not that unusual.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I was wondering if Gustav Deutsch, if he was the same generation as Petr Kubelka, perhaps.
They may have been separated by a little bit, but I'm pretty sure that they were very familiar with each other, because they were both in part of the Vienna kind of scene. I don't know if Deutsch studied with him. I would have to look that up. But I would feel comfortable saying that they knew each other.
Yeah. No, because I just remembered some of Kubelka's films, like the ones in Africa, right? I forgot the titles and so on, but
right.
Indeed, yeah.
Afrika-Reise, our trip to Africa. Yeah, where it's the home movies.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that there's he's part of that kind of that era of experimental film's interest in reworking existing footage. So he's part of a much larger trend towards reuse, but he has a kind of idiosyncratic approach often to what both the materials that he's using and then the way that he's reworking them.
Yeah.
I see, Yanni has a question about.
Yeah, she has what do you think of the aestheticization of microscopic and macroscopic images by post-production softwares? For example, the various computer-generated images of COVID.
I'll just relay something that I learned. Part of one of the classes that I'm teaching this semester is on the classes on data visualization, and so we spent a whole couple of weeks on COVID because it's such a ubiquitous example of data visualization right now. So part of it, we were looking at sort of mapping and dashboards and how do you model spread, but then part of it was how do we know what COVID looks like? Where did this image come from? And there's a great interview that Museum of the Moving Image did with one of the people from the CDC who created the sort of the most famous image. And she talks about it in this really interesting way. She's a medical illustrator. And so this was connected to a screening of the Fleischer film, Fantastic Voyage. And she talked about seeing that film when she was in school as a kind of an example of how to visualize the inside of the body. And she talked about coming up with the image of the virus, which had to be done very quickly. Because this was part of a public health alert, and they wanted to give people, something to look at to help anchor the health information. And so, some of the things that I thought were most interesting were the aesthetic decisions that she had to make, and her kind of very straightforward and matter-of-fact admission that this is not an accurate image of COVID that we see. But it's an image that is meant to emphasize certain things. So the fact that the spikes are red, there's no color on that scale. It's below the wavelength of light. So color is something that is an interpretive feature of the image. But, red signifies danger in Western culture. So that's why the spikes are red, because they wanted to make it look scary and dangerous. She also had this really interesting way of talking about the decision, that there's a kind of a single COVID virus particle as opposed to a lot, and she talked about it as a portrait, and almost like a movie star portrait. Like here's our star. We have to do our star. And if you look closely at it, you realize some of the visual qualities of the image borrow from kind of photography, so that it's not all in focus, right? There's a limited plane of focus, and so it borrows from kind of photographic portraiture, and I'll let me see if I can find it real quick, and I can share the link. But yeah, that was I don't know if that answers the question about post-production software, because I frankly don't know enough about that to say. I would love to learn about that myself. So, you know, if Jane wants to expand on that, that would be
yeah,
really...
yeah. We had some more questions.
Sure.
Like, in your perspective, after the COVID-19, it's from Alexandre. After the pandemic, what will be the horizon on scientific discourse in films about pandemics? Yeah. And then, and there's another one from Cicero, Oliver. It's could you provide the name of the researcher, the medical illustrator from CDC, or the name for the video interview?
Yeah, that's what I'm working on right now, to try to get you that. But in terms of what will films about pandemics look like post-COVID? That's a great question. I don't know how they'll be. I mean, I imagine within a year or so we'll start to get the first wave of films that start to reflect, you know, what has happened and what will continue to happen during the pandemic. I mean, I will say that the film that we watched in this class was Contagion, and it's really quite close. I mean, there's overemphasis in that film on surfaces, which I think we're learning now is also something that was overemphasized early on. So fomite transmission doesn't seem to be as big of a deal, but so much of the social dynamics and just the look and the feel is really close, and that's not surprising because that filmmaking team too was really invested in you know, listening carefully to the scientific advisors that they got for that film.
Yeah.
See that Rosanna already beat me to the name of the illustrator. Her name's Alyssa Eckert. And I don't know. It's on YouTube. Museum of the Modern Image. Maybe this is it. Maybe I can find it. And it's up there. It's a conversation with her and a medical historian from one of the California schools.
And Jani, she adds something else about the same thing with the images from Mars. So what do you think about this footage? Like, we have like these representations of the Martian surface and so on.
Yeah, I think, you know, both. So the film that we just looked at the other day was Powers of 10. So, you know, it's the trip out into the cosmos and then the trip down into the microscopic. And I think, you know, this is one of the most, I think, powerful areas of overlap, is to think of science as related to science fiction. So to think of speculative fiction not in opposition to actual science, but in constant contact and conversation with it. So the visualizations of Mars in, say, The Martian, right? That those were advised and you know, kind of done in collaboration with actual Mars scientists and researchers, and how sometimes also there are kind of like in the domain of modeling. So in what's the film called where they go into or near the black hole?
Interstellar.
Yeah, in Interstellar, you know, Kip Thorne is an astrophysicist, and he was really interested in advising for the film, in part because they could do a simulation for him because they had the budget and they had the computing power. that he couldn't afford to do himself. And so that, you know, those are kind of rare instances, but I think they are worth highlighting as moments of kind of connection. And I mean, this is something that I'm interested in sort of beyond this current project about the encyclopedia, is this transit between Hollywood special effects and scientific visualization. So, you know, sort of since the dawn of CGI, there's been this intense back and forth between academic research and high-end Hollywood special effects, both in terms of people and also in terms of algorithms and hardware. So that's something that I you know would point to as an example of the Mars. Yeah, a lot of that is created using software and using people that kind of can go back and forth. There's right here where I live in Maryland, we're close to the Goddard Space Flight Center, and they have a visualization unit, and their job is to sort of make these Hollywood quality visualizations of their science missions, in part because they realize how powerful it is to be able to give, you know, non-scientists or even other scientists a sense of what they're doing, you know, in a kind of a clearly communicable way.
Yeah, there is a very good book on this subject called Lab Coats in Hollywood.
Yeah,
I forgot the name of the author, but
David Kirby.
David Kirby, yes.
Absolutely.
So
his idea of the diegetic prototyping, you know, I think that is a key concept that, you know, you can use film to imagine the future, imagine scenarios, and that's a, you know, kind of a really powerful tool for thought.
Yeah, to extrapolate on possibilities and so on. Yeah. And it's being done, like there is a long history of the scientific advisory. As far as I remember, Fritz Lang's Woman on the Moon, and also the 1950s movie Destination Moon, the American movie that had like the illustrations by Chazzy Bonestel and also Lily Lay's advisory. So there's a long record of dialogue between science and film imagery. Mm-hmm.
So I found the link. How do I leave a comment? Do I have to log in?
I have no idea. Maybe Cicero can help us, or if you see
I'll email it to you right now, and we'll get.
Yeah, please do that. Then I put on the chat on YouTube. I put on the chat.
Right.
Jorge Prudencio, he has another question. I'm going back to these discontent. Like he asks if the scientific film has to be typically a documentary, or it can admit, or it can be it can absorb dramatizations, or it can be like almost a fiction film and still be considered a scientific film. So it's all about these blurred boundaries between fiction film and scientific film. So, and I remember that somewhere else you spoke about that, about the definition. I think Wolf's definition of documentary film. So I think Jorge's question is a little bit about that. Is every single scientific film also a documentary, or you can have like a fiction film and it can be scientific film as well?
Yeah, I mean, to go back to a moment in the Bazin essay, Bazin's claim is that microbes are the greatest actors in the world. So I think, you know, this is.
I think it froze.
Am I still coming through?
Yeah.
Okay.
Now,
how about now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Now.
Okay. Yeah, he has a little he has a few sentences where he says, you know, is it scientific film? Is it not? Is it documentary? Is it, you know, is it fiction? And he kind of throws up his hands. He's like, I'm not interested in this question. The main thing is to enjoy these films. And so I have I guess in some ways a kind of a similar attitude. I don't think it's irrelevant to try to do a taxonomy the way Wolf does. I think it's quite helpful to distinguish between or among research film, educational film, you know, educational film for university, high school, you know, primary school audiences. Those are all meaningful distinctions. But I don't think that is kind of at the core, nor is the question of kind of dramatization or fictionalization, I think, the key issue. Because science film, I think, can sort of be, you know, it can move among these modes. And that I prefer a kind of a flexible approach to the question, and without sort of throwing out the need to have a definition. That's my evasive answer to that. And Alfredo, you're muted right now.
Oh, sorry.
There you go.
Thank you. Let me see if there is any kind of last minute question.
So I just emailed you the link to the YouTube.
Okay. Let me open I'll put on the chat. Let me see. You emailed me and I didn't get it. Not yet, but
I think my connection is starting to become unstable here.
Yeah, I think we are kind of 5 to 5, so you must be tired. And
okay. I like talking about this stuff.
Oh, great. So let's see if there is any last question. Come on, everybody. Hey, everyone is invited to write down the last minute questions. Any further questions? I think I had one. No, you talked about the borders between scientific cinema and art experimental cinema. Could you just elaborate a little bit more about the idea of scientific cinema as slow cinema that you mentioned?
Yeah. So, I mean, the Bunte, I think, is doing that. So you saw it there, and there was an example of it in the clip that I showed right at the end of the opening kind of clip that I showed, that sequence where you're literally watching the minute hand of the clock. I think a lot of times, you know, scientific observation is about duration. It's about watching something carefully over time, even if there aren't radical changes. So I think, you know, that's a shared concern. I mean, a lot of times scientific film is interested in abridging duration, you know, through things like time lapse. But there are lots of sort of pockets of this durational approach. I think, especially like in things like psychology, where you're sort of, you know, watching people interact or live their lives. And I guess, you know, to come back to the ethnographic, you know, to see the kind of process. And, you know, I think here about sort of the Salome Skwirsky's recent book about the process genre, that there's a lot of overlap there, you know, that scientific film can be interested in watching processes unfold. So yeah, I think it's it's a link, a strong kind of shared commitment and interest in temporal unspooling that isn't accelerated.
Yeah, it made me think of Tarkovsky's book, Sculpting Time, like the idea of film as a sculpting time. And I think scientific cinema as a whole, like in general, that's a concern. Yeah, or at least capturing that time, the essence of time, or yeah, indeed. Well, let's see. There is some last questions, comment. In Brazil, we're living in a period, from Alexandre. In Brazil, we're living in a period of denial of science. Not only in Brazil,
not just Brazil.
we are living in we hope that films can be an important counterpoint to the formation of, indeed, films can be a useful tool. Let cinema be the subversive element of negative thinking, of denial, Yeah, just a comment, but very welcome, these comments.
I agree. I mean, this is so maybe this is a good note to end on. Scientific cinema, I think, is often seen as a kind of a boring cinema, a cinema that is in the service of vested interests, a cinema that's a kind of a fundamentally conservative form of cinema. But I think that's a kind of a very limited and distorted view of what science is. Science can also be radical, and I think more often than not is, especially in this current climate, where it's sort of basic insights are often being questioned, and its basic procedures, its openness to self-critique, its openness to improvement. That these films now more than ever deserve to be recovered, reappreciated, and so I mean that's one of the it's one of the continual kind of joys for me of working in this area.
Yeah, for us all. Yeah, science can be as engaging as any kind of fiction film, right? Yeah, in many ways.
Absolutely. Yeah. Or even better. So I just sent you the link. My
okay. Let me see here. Let me see if just put the yeah, there you go. I'm gonna put on the chat so everybody can have access to this interview. All right, so it's on the chat. Well, I think it's 5 p.m. here. You must be tired, Oliver.
Getting there.
Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. Thank you for being so generous, sharing your thoughts on this subject. That in Brazil, as I told you before, there is a community very, very interested in scientific cinema, but I think it's everywhere, right? The whole world. Those people, we need to kind of build up a network, a proper community that can share thoughts and film archive, tell about film archives, etc. Because sometimes we have no idea that maybe, for instance, in Argentina we have Andrea Quaterolo. She's a specialist in Argentinian scientific cinema too. So it's really important to talk further on the subject, to keep this dialogue. So thank you very, very much. Well, I hope we overcome this situation, this pandemic, and next year, 2021, maybe the second semester, most likely you are able to come, and then we can have an event in the flesh, right?
That would be wonderful. I very much look forward to it, And thank you. It's exciting. I mean, I used to think that this was, such a tiny kind of backwater in terms of film history, but it is opening out, and connections like this are, the sort of the lifeblood of this emerging area. So I'm grateful to you for your invitation and for the ability to have this time to talk to you and everybody on the live stream. And yeah, looking forward to further connections, further moments of exchange.
Oh, that's great. I didn't tell you because I had actually I have no power here. There was a storm.
Is that why it went dark?
Yeah.
Wow,
So
you're on battery?
I'm using my cell phone to get the internet, the Wi-Fi signal. I didn't tell you that, but when you were kind of finishing your talk, there was a big storm here, and everything just shut down, and had no power. But I'm happy that we came to this point, and we had a pleasant and fascinating lecture and online event. Thank you so much, Oliver.
Thank you, Alfredo.
Thanks to everyone who is staying with us this afternoon. I hope you had enjoyed as much as I did. And okay, so look forward to seeing you here in Brazil, Oliver.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you very much. You too.
Bye.
Keep safe. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.